A change in equality.
How the Harlem Renaissance triumphantly and tragically impacted America.
The Harlem Renaissance, a truly beautiful time in United States history.
A time that introduced Americans to jazz, a time always associated with a dancing crowd.
The 1920s in America brought the Harlem Renaissance, a revolutionary decade in which a mass of African Americans migrated north, sparking a triumphant movement whose significance is still present today.
The triumph of the Harlem Renaissance introduced African American culture to white Americans. This was the first step to integration and equality, and ultimately set the stage for the civil rights movement, tragically ending with the Great Depression.
The Harlem Renaissance was during the 1920s in the United States when African Americans migrated to the Harlem neighborhood in New York City, leading to an amazingly triumphant time in U.S. history. It was significant to history because it was a blooming of African American culture and creative arts. Continuously, the decade proves how this was one of the most influential movements for African American culture to this day.
Triumphantly, the Harlem Renaissance led to the Black Pride movement, which is still present in American culture today. In the 1910s in the south of the U.S., there were countless natural disasters that put Black workers and sharecroppers out of work. During and after World War I, immigration to the United States fell, and recruiters from northern companies headed south to look for workers, sparking the Great Migration.
Triumphantly, this resulted in the blooming of African American culture in the creative arts, musical theater, visual arts, and music. The most influential members of the era sought to expose white America to amazing African American culture, breaking away from the stereotype inflicted on Black Americans by white Americans. However, how did this all begin? Before the Harlem Renaissance, the Harlem neighborhood in New York City was an upper-class neighborhood with rich white citizens.
A change occurred in the area when, during the 1880s, rapid overdevelopment led to landlords needing to make more money and fill many empty buildings. During the early 1900s, some middle-class Black families from the Black Bohemia neighborhood moved to Harlem.
At first, all of the upper-class elites wanted to get rid of the growing Black population, but when they failed to do so, many of them fled the area. The Harlem Renaissance led to the Black Pride movement, which is still present in American culture today. This was in response to white Americans' racism and encouraged Black Americans to embrace their Black culture.
The Harlem Renaissance led to the formation of many organizations that profited African Americans. This momentous decade was triumphant for the exposure of Black culture as well as the American way of life.
These organizations included the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the National Urban League, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The UNIA, the National Urban League, and the NAACP all still exist to this day, proving how amazingly influential this time period truly was. The Harlem Renaissance inspired and encouraged African Americans to make their mark in history, introducing the new Negro.
This movement pushed young Black Americans to defy white standards and express their true selves through their culture, which propelled the start of the fast-approaching civil rights movement.
During this explosion of African American culture, there were many influential musicians that changed jazz music forever, adding to the overall triumph of the roaring 1920s.
Hello, Dolly. This is Louis Dolly.
Louis Armstrong, born August 4, 1901, was an extremely influential musician during the Harlem Renaissance, despite growing up in a poor area of New Orleans. Armstrong had a very difficult childhood like most kids who grew up in the area, and a local Jewish family greatly encouraged him to keep singing and to keep loving music.
His life changed on New Year's Eve of 1912 when he shot his stepfather's shotgun in the air and was arrested on the spot. Because of this, he was sent to the Colored Waifs Home for Boys. There at the boys' home, Armstrong received musical instruction on the cornet and fell in love with music.
After his time in the boys' home, Louis Armstrong was beginning to become well known for his amazing jazz cornet playing. Since his popularity was soaring, Armstrong moved to New York City and performed many times in Harlem, as well as recorded dozens of records that became extremely popular.
My heart is sad and I'm all alone.
Gender equality was also a large topic brought to light during this time, which was very victorious as female singers such as Bessie Smith emerged during this time period of post-war equality and open sexuality, paving the way for future female artists.
Billie Holiday, yet another amazing musician during this time, was born April 7, 1915, in Philadelphia. Despite a difficult childhood, she has been said to be the most influential jazz singer in history. In the early 1920s, the singer and her mother moved to Harlem, as so many African Americans at the time.
Throughout her tough childhood, Holiday found her love for music and pursued it with passion. When Billie was only 18 years old, she was discovered by producer John Hammond while she was performing in a Harlem jazz club. From there, her career took off. Known very well for her melancholy, expressive singing voice, Billie Holiday recorded with many successful musicians, such as Teddy Wilson, Duke Ellington, and Lester Young.
Among many accomplishments, Holiday wrote an autobiography in 1956 called Lady Sings the Blues, and was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the year 2000, making history as being one of the first few African American women to be on the Wall of Fame. Quite clearly, Billie Holiday was a beloved musician that was arguably one of the most influential jazz singers of all time. Unfortunately, she passed away from substance abuse on July 17, 1959.
Despite the fact that the Harlem Renaissance was incredibly triumphant, tragically not all of it was positive. Although many positive steps towards equality were taken by the United States government and publicized this early in the civil rights movement, the U.S. remained a place that discriminated greatly on the basis of race.
An example of this tragic reality was the Cotton Club, which was Harlem's most famous nightclub. Despite making stars of some of the most influential African American names of the time, the club only allowed white customers, showing how historically far America was from the civil rights movement. The Harlem Renaissance was a great decade that ended tragically. The stock market crash that led to the Great Depression was one of the worst transitions in U.S. history.
The Prohibition, which started in 1920, was a nationwide constitutional ban that made it illegal to produce, import, transport, and sell alcohol in the United States. This ended in 1933, meaning people no longer looked for illegal alcohol in uptown clubs, which was tragic for business owners in Harlem. Another reason for the end of the Harlem Renaissance is the interest in job seeking by the residents of Harlem, another byproduct of the stock market crash.
However, the final straw, and a day that is truly a benchmark for the end of the Renaissance, was the riot in 1935. This broke out after the arrest of a young black shoplifter and resulted in the death of one person. Hundreds of people were injured, and millions of dollars were lost in property damage. Despite this tragic and negative ending, we can look back at the Harlem Renaissance as a beautiful, triumphant time in United States history and needs to be forever celebrated.
The historical progress made during this time period shaped America by introducing African American culture to white Americans, being the first step to integration and equality, and ultimately setting the stage for the civil rights movement. The end of the Renaissance, however, brought the horrific, tragic stock market crash.
With all that we know about the current stance of our country and how it was influenced by historical events,
the question still remains:
did the triumph of the Harlem Renaissance outweigh the tragedy of the Great Depression?